we regrettably realized, not regrettably, we sadly realized that a lot of farmers have been on mute. Farm is a business.
Sure.
It's way beyond the crops. We consume 1 billion chickens a year.
1 billion.
1 billion, dog. 1 billion
Wow.
chickens. We need to place everything on mute and ask ourselves, who has a handle and who is gatekeeping or dog keeping on the macro value chains?
Spread the fire.
Spread the fire.
Spread the fire.
Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX. And today I'm extremely excited to welcome a dynamic guest, Mr. Shadrack Kubyane, who is one of the most inspiring entrepreneurs in our country at the moment. He's currently working at the intersection of the food supply chain and blockchain technologies. He's had a storied career in the corporate world. And today we're going to speak about his experiences becoming a successful entrepreneur, but also some of his insights on South Africa's food security, its agricultural landscape, blockchain technology, and what he's learned rising through the ranks of entrepreneurship. Shadrack, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you kindly. It's great to be here. Thank you for your hospitality.
Not at all, not at all. It's great to have you. And, you know, your venture, eFama app, which we're going to get into, has really raised many. Can you give us some money here at SMWX? That would be great, because then we'll be good. I know there are many millions there, so
we can
talk?
We can make some calls. We can make some calls, definitely.
Comment down below if you. This is a contract. It's done. It's done.
Definitely.
No, I mean it's been wonderful to watch your rise, and
Yes.
and obviously you're an extremely successful entrepreneur now.
Thank you kindly.
But that's not an overnight thing. Overnight successes take years and decades.
I wish it was overnight.
Hey,
I wish it was.
yeah, don't we all?
Look at that.
But tell me a bit about, you know, the journey and the moment of success when you felt that eFama had, and of course success, you know, is a long journey, and there's more success to come, but that moment when you had tried, you had left the corporate world, and finally, you know, you had got to a place that was on a different plane.
Talking about the transition from corporate, I personally wished it was done differently, for the sake of my health mainly, and for better sleep. You've got this book that you sometimes share with the family, the Democracy and Delusion. I think business does have that delusional dynamic to it. And while I might have not admitted this in my early days when I left corporate, I can admit it now that there was a whole lot of dead ends and knocking my head around the walls. That was a bit unnecessary. I know later on, as an entrepreneur, you're tempted to say, man, that was tuition fees. But some fees are a bit unnecessary. I'll give you an example. I wish as early on my business journey personally, which kicked off as far back as 2009, and by the time I now left corporate to attempt my shot at business, that was not even my first take. My first take goes a bit far back than that. I had a crashed and burned business back in 2003. That's how I bounced into corporate and go like, man, I need to pack this. Went through varsity, led a successful team there. So when I was now re-emerging, I wish there was a sense of family that I put around myself, because if you notice, my wife and I, we joke around sometimes and say, if there was an ant that arrived in Sandton for some reason, Sandton being our neighborhood where we both work, play, and live, and it's more for an extreme sports, more on that later. So if an ant was to arrive in Sandton, a humble ant, the first thing that it will do would be what would it do? So we kind of like muse around that, and we both reached this safe conclusion of what the likelihood will be. The ant will try and plug into a sense of community. It will try and locate the nearest colony. But no, not me. I thought, let me fly solo. Let me show this big boys club how it's done. And Man, that was about 10 years of really a school of hard knocks. So that's the first thing that on my journey to co-founding eFama, I wish that I was a lot more sensitive to, because the other thing that I joke around with my co-founder and wife is business is actually easy. And that may sound as a bit of a counter logic. The hardest part is to decide on your verticals. It's to decide on what are you going to be sold out to or sold out for. And in that regard, focus, I'll give you a bit of context and also the family. We have some mentors we have in the US, among our ecosystem of mentors, locally and offshore. Those mentors, man, they're in their 60s. And husband and wife, they recently began an app, which it's a story for another day, but within 3 years, that app already saw 8 million users on it. And they go like, oh, we're doing decently well, but we're not there yet. And we go like, but why? They go like, no, there's this other guy down the street. Him and a 19-year-old started an app, and now it's sitting at 500 million. And that's an app that most people have never heard about, at least in that sense. But it's got 500 million. So when you see us now within the eFama journey, kind of like being a bit impatient with ourselves a bit, and also striving well beyond what could be considered South African standards, and also striving to realize and maintain a focus that we're not competing within a South African landscape. The minute you go digital, the minute you go startup, you don't know. There might be a 19 or even a 14-year-old in the basement out there in Silicon Valley, busy coding, putting together a few lines of code to go like, I'm heading to South Africa next. So you don't know where your threat is going to come from or where your challenge. So in that regard, I'm glad that our beginnings, both my co-founder and I, they didn't start in the big city with the limelight, but way back in the village, way back where it's still our grounding. Just even yesterday, before this conversation, we just came back from a village. So I'm glad that before leaving corporate, before embarking on the journey for eFama, even after other business projects crashed and burned, before all that, the noise, the good and the bad and the ugly, I'm glad that our upbringing and our beginning is right in the village, where I'll touch on it at some point, that it still keeps us grounded. Yes, we think global, and we try to be locally relevant, but really our roots and where we borrow our thesis on how we navigate life and business goes back to the village.
So tell me about how the idea for eFama came about and how that links to your life story.
Good question. My wife, Preeti, and I, we were raised by farming industrious villages. And on my side of the story, emerging as a young boy around the early years, the childish years, I found myself trapped in a positive way between two very feisty, very industrious, very, very bold women. I was raised by two generations of farmers. And my gran, the late Gogo Lucy, she was a lot more bold. She was also on the adventurous side. In the heart of South Africa, a territory not known for coffee, she became a coffee farmer. I might also want to mention that she's a former unionist who, when she left the workplace and she left the shop stewarding and all that, representing the voice of workers, she just kind of like, not even as a retirement, but as a new pastime, she began farming coffee. And in the middle of all of that, I believe my mom caught the bug, the farming bug, but she played it a lot safer. My mom, she started kind of like growing your typical crops, but she was in a consortium partnership with other village farmers. They wouldn't call it a fancy thing like a consortia. They had an arrangement.
Where was this, by the way?
A good question. I was born at the intersection of not two, but three provinces, where the Great North, or Limpopo, intersects with the Northwest Province, and then they both intersect with Gauteng. So from where we are sitting, if I look ahead in our chat, I could see the beginning of the boundary line of Limpopo, and behind us will be Northwest, and just straight ahead will be Gauteng. So I was literally born, and that strategically served me well when I ended up in corporate. And now it's serving me now, because not only was I raised by farmers, not only was I trapped in the clutches of their frustrations, such as when we have to take our produce to the silo in terms of maize meal, and the inequalities and the unfairness, and how the equation will be slanted there in favor of the boogeyman who ran the silo. And so from the early days, I got to
absolutely
appreciate not just the struggle of the common person, as I saw these two women kind of like sweat it out, but I also found myself very privileged that the intersecting provinces also gifted me with finding myself in a melting pot of cultures. Because later on, when in my Africa travels, whether wearing the corporate hat or later on ending up wearing a management consulting hat, because that's a business that led to eFama, both required business diplomacy. And there can be no business diplomacy unless there is first and foremost a humble appreciation of the cultural dynamics in the terrain. Let me muse a little bit by saying, maybe after our conversation, I interest you in saying, you know what, Sizwe, if you have about, you know what, Doc, if you have a bit of half an hour, let me see if you're keen to pass by the Faraday taxi rank there, or by the Maimai taxi rank. Why would I, why would I appeal to your audience to say, listen, let's pass there and maybe go and have a bit of scope, and join them, the men there that are in a circle. I don't know, maybe there's a bit of a water drum, and they found a bit of a piece of wood, and they're having scope, which is equal their dining room, equal their boardroom. If I interest you to say, man, let's just be brave. Let's go there and maybe appeal to say, listen, come on the other end. I come on the other end. We both wearing green, so maybe that's a good sign. And then let's go in there and tell them, guys, lunch is on us. Don't worry. No. Carry on with Scopo. Let's just kind of like lean forward to join this. Why I'm mentioning that bit of an extreme unlikely example, because I value my life and so do you, Doc. Why I wouldn't do that is because just like how we need to tread, not just with caution, but with mutual respect around territories that may not necessarily regard you and I as having street cred for those environments. I think the same applies to Santin, which I mentioned earlier on, to say my entry into farming, into technology, into supply chain, and also into the richest square mile on the continent. If you want to build something that wants to just have resilience, but will also take off with success, appeal to funders, I found myself humbled because I was not in a scope or feasting environment, but the Santan boardrooms, those glass towers, they also require a bit of appreciation of what street cred means in those setups. So going back to my village, knowing that we had the Tsonga community there, we had even the community from Zim coming in there with their merchants, we had the community from Botswana coming in there selling different kind of goods, we had the various tribes, Barolong, Bakweneng, all these type of tribes coming together. We had the vendor community there in the middle, and we had everyone in between. So that's a melting pot that, unless you have an organic appreciation for diplomacy at a human-to-human, non-textbook approach, you're either going to be frustrated there, or you're going to soak in the appreciation for, wow, language, food, different people. So I suppose to an extent, between being shaped and raised by those two women, but I was to an extent also molded by my village environment. Very modest, but quite molded and prepared for the path that I now find myself in at the intersection of technology, farming frustrations, blockchain, and to an extent, broken or unequal supply chains.
So tell us then what eFama does to take that history, of the two women who raised you, looking at the frustrations of farming, looking at life at the intersection of these different provinces in South Africa. You go to the corporate world, management consulting, that's a tough place to get into.
Sure.
It's the height of the corporate world in many ways. Start some businesses, and then what is the idea then that comes to your mind that, okay, this is how we connect all those things with the technology that we have?
Good question. If we look back in our review mirror on the COVID days, we often recall, most of us here can recall, where someone in a meeting will go like, "You're on mute." And that's not a good thing when you are trying to project a point or project yourself and then you're on mute. However, leading up to the founding of eFama, we sadly realized that a lot of farmers have been on mute. And they didn't need just a voice. They needed means to participate gainfully and actively and mutually so in the economic streams of society. We speak about sustainable development goals that the UN has set, the SDGs, 2030 and all that. Those are things that are a bit too distant on the horizon to a farmer who's just thinking, listen, we've got about 1 hectare of madumbi, or we have 10 hectares of various crops. And whenever we attempt, maybe they're in deep rural in KZN, maybe they're in Msinga, maybe they're down there towards Jozini, maybe they're even down there towards Matatiela. And all they're thinking is, wait a minute, how do we get our produce to leave our hands, leave our farm, and make its way to market?
Sure.
Where it could end up on the dining tables of hotels. It can end up being part of 5-star restaurants. And if all else fails, or if all intents and purposes, even if their produce can end up being part of our dinner tonight.
Sure.
And we found that such farmers, because we have various types, we've got your corporate farmers, you've got your mid-sized farmers, and then you've got your sustenance, which turned out to be hand-to-mouth farmers. Those make a much bigger base. And we often joke around to say, just like, what's his name, Ndade Bonang Mohale of Bidvest, in his early days, he used to be in the elevator business. And in the elevator business with a whole lot of other businesses, both locally and offshore, we often joke to say through eFama, even though we are using layers of code, we're using technology to shape this e-commerce that is connecting rural to urban, that is connecting farmers to consumers and commercial buyers. One thing that we muse around is that we are also building a giant elevator, because sadly our farmers, despite being hardworking, just like my mom and granny, their hard work quite often really is scattered all over the place. They don't get to really harvest the gainful rewards of their hard work, because 1, they're still on mute, 2, they're trapped in the basement economically. So how do we send the elevator down to go fetch them? And we found that tech, when it is aligned correctly for social good, not just for profit or for commerce, tech can help this villager over here, being in the big city, to build a connecting bridge that brings not just the village to the city, because the village does come to the city. That's one thing that I need to emphasize. But it comes to the city through the wrong hands, between Umhlaba Lingana or between Kokstad or between any rural locality. There's sometimes up to 20 middlemen between that gogo, between that malume, who have appointed themselves as the powers that be in order to facilitate trade between that humble rural ecosystem and the big city, where the pricing for crops is better. Yes, there are some regional markets that exist, but even those markets, our crop losses, our post-harvest losses are way too high. So how do we, through patient capital, which is what we've embarked on, and how do we patiently build a parallel supply chain that both rural and also other excluded peri-urban farmers can find way to unmute themselves and to negate the need for an inflationary level of middlemen that are no longer needed. You know, we all need middlemen, but when there are 20 instead of being 2, then you find that those gogos really, they themselves are starving. You know, the idea of a starving farmer is something that we sometimes discuss when we go like, why did we start eFama? A starving farmer, imagine, I remember we were doing the rounds. We were going around the country. We do that a lot. I just did 6,000 kilometers recently traveling. I remember in the early days while we didn't want to build code. We just wanted to understand what keeps farmers awake beyond my grand, beyond my mom. And we found that one of them was saying, you know what, Abantanabam, you see that truck there that is leaving with my crops with a big retail name on it. There's hardly any middleman there. The retailers send their truck here, their cold truck. I'm part of their cold chain, but I won't see the money for my crops for up to 6 months. And between now and 6 months, my children and I are going to really be having to fend for ourselves. So yeah, so I suppose eFama in a nutshell is an attempt to use technology to shape that elevator we can send down to go and fetch those that are trapped in the basement. Life is happening up there on the top floor. You know, there's industry, there's food supply chains, but they are just ousted or iced out of benefiting from the value chain, which from the village, I got to see those kind of things.
Let's talk about the supply chains, because I think you've had a unique insight into the food supply chain in South Africa, right? From, you know, production all the way to consumption at the end. And, you know, food is something that feels just so, you know, it's something you consume and you don't often think about, okay, if I think back to how this came onto my table, and then I look at the South African economy and the concentration of wealth that is in every industry. We often overlook the concentration of wealth that is in this industry. And tell us about those supply chains and how they work and how they're working to frustrate a black farmer in a rural area or a semi-rural area that's just trying to get some income.
Good question. You know, I'll start this with a number, a very specific number. There's 60 million of us, maybe 60.2 if you ask around, South Africans by population. A surprise to the family might be to discover that as modest as the number 60 million sounds, we consume 1 billion chickens a year.
1 billion?
1 billion, dog. 1 billion chickens. Just chickens.
Sure.
We didn't get to the bacon, we didn't get to the salami, we didn't get to the mutton and the lamb. Just 1 billion chickens.
Wow, South Africa. Wow.
Yeah. So it's one of those.
There you are. You've been exposed.
It's one of those championships. We've clinched that award. So how does that lend itself in our appreciation of supply chains? Farming was not the only thing that my mom did. She also delved into 8 other businesses. She delved into transport. She delved into food supply, as in running a spaza shop. She delved into running a salon. She delved into leasing out tickets to workers that couldn't afford to buy a ticket, but they needed it that day. And so why is that important? My wife and I, when we recently went through my town or through my village, to our surprise, we found that there is a food processing, there's a processed meat plant that has been set up in my village there. And it supplies direct to the public. And my wife couldn't understand. How is it that in your region, you guys eat such processed meat beyond even chicken? I mean, there's chicken Viennas, there's everything. That actually the powers that be decided to set up a plant near your village. I go like, I come to think of it. In the spaza shop I ran on behalf of my mom before I left for the big city at 15, one of the things that I was a supplier of at that minuscule level was processed meats. was your Polonies, was your Viennas and stuff like that. And why am I mentioning the 1 billion chickens and touching on processed meat? And also I would, at 4 a.m., while the village is still waking up, I'll be receiving about a number of crates of bread. So I was supplying bread as well. So the food supply chain is something that I was introduced to at a very young age. And later on, beyond my corporate days, I went into consulting on the supply chain side. And I can tell you, let me put something in context in terms of what has been happening of recent 2023. There's been a lot of upheaval. There's been a lot of unsettlement across the country. There's been a lot of dialogue. There's been also been certain visits, particularly to the spaza shop setup. And there's been, to say the least, some complaints that why are we being served counterfeit foods?
Sure.
And there'll be a complaint of, why does this particular sausage, processed food, why does it now separate and pull apart when I'm trying to fry it like normal wors? What is this? So I want to appeal.
Children dying in some instances.
Very, very tragically, children dying, and also the health department having to mechanize and mobilize, and particularly those children dying. Here's what I put to our fellow countrymen and women. We will do well when it comes to food supply chains. We will do well to resist the temptation of, how do I call it? Not necessarily bias, but being selective. Compromised food is compromised food. Whether it is dispensed via the spaza outlet or is dispensed via a JSE listed economic titan. Why am I saying that? As recent as 2017, I think there's 3 children that died last year in 2023, and there's others, but collectively, if my numbers serve me correctly, not more than 20 deaths were recorded. And for me personally, being a dad and being a fellow human, 1 death is unacceptable. However, if you go slightly far back in our rearview mirror, in 2017, more than 200 recorded lives were lost. Remember I mentioned processed food earlier on? When processed foods were compromised. And not 1, not 2, but I think up to 5 listed retailers were party to that, what we can call wrongdoing, or they dropped the ball, and there was still a lot of fingers pointing in many directions. So in our world as eFama, wrong is wrong, number 1. Number 2, in our world, transparent and equitable supply chains in food are the only supply chains that we want in our future. Why is that? Because that 2017 matter is still before the courts today. No, he said, I said, this records, those records. You mentioned blockchain earlier on. We wish that blockchain was already a norm back then, not in a crypto sense. I'll touch on that later. We wish that blockchain was a norm back then in 2017, and blockchain was a norm in 2023 on a scalable level, because blockchain is that dynamic whereby it's not you said, I said. If you're holding a memo there, the memo that I'm holding on whether raw material or the raw ingredients came from, whether for processed foods, for dry spices, ground spices, we are all holding the same memo, and I'll touch on that later. But it's not about, hey, now it's blockchain, it's this fancy thing. No. We're not keen on blockchain as a fancy tool, but we're keen on the truth. We're keen on, wait a minute, those women, those hardworking women in KZN that are farming Madumbi, how is it that when I buy them off a certain retailer's shelf, how is it that when I buy them, they receive 1 rand for every 100 rand that I spend on this thing? And of course, there's this, for lack of a better word, the villager in me, there's this 20 creepy uncles in between that really, really pay themselves quite handsomely and at the expense of those hardworking farming women. So it's about supply chains that are transparent, that are equitable, that are fair, whether that food is being dispensed through a tiny hole of a spaza or is being dispensed through an exquisite, well-lit retail shelf in Santen. It doesn't matter. Is it fair? Were the people compensated well? are there no rogue ingredients that found themselves in this? And is what's written outside what's actually inside? So that's why when we are patiently building eFama, the eFama of the future, but also the broader rethinking of our national supply chains. We're looking at advisory mechanisms to government, advisory mechanisms to regulators. So we're not just, oh no, let's build our thing. No, we are rethinking the South Africa of the future, where those that have got economic value due to them must receive it. And those of us that would like to know, when we are having our fine dining, where does this food come from? Can actually trace it back to either that humble farmer or that gigantic farming corporate. Fair is fair.
Thanks for watching SMWX. I just wanted to tell you, if you're enjoying what you're watching, how you can help support this channel and keep us growing and becoming bigger and better. Become a member of the channel on YouTube. There are different membership plans, and you can give us some fuel to fire the SMWX machine. Also, if you're a brand, I'm interested in building the community of people who watch this channel. And so if you want to advertise, I'm much more interested in the people who are already fans of this channel partnering with us than going out to some external advertising brand. So get in touch with us at our email address down below. You can also buy books and merchandise. Check the description for how to support SMWX and help spreading the fire. Of course, the more we do this, the bigger we can grow this channel, the more resources we can use to keep informing and entertaining you. Now let's get back to the episode. So let's go deeper into these supply chains, because, you know, on the one hand, there's been this debate in South Africa leading all the way to those spaza shops and informal trading, deaths of children, which is also linked to a worrying debate about which gets linked to foreign nationals, and then it gets linked to some, the worst of that can go into like a terrible xenophobic direction, right? But as a country, we do need to understand what that supply chain is and how that kind of supply chain has been built. We might need to replicate it, in terms of, our, a rural farmer understanding how they need to tap into a wider network. So there's that supply chain, and there are foreign nationals who have understood and mastered that supply chain. And there's a reason why they can outcompete a local spaza shop. Then there's another whole supply chain of the big corporates, which will that's how food ends up on the shelves.
Making inroads,
So there are these two, let's call them two supply chains, and it seems to me that the average trying to make ends meet South African farmer falls outside both.
Good question. There is the average South African farmer trying to make ends meet, trying to feed the family. And on the other extreme end of the equation, but quite part of the same equation, is the average, let's call them a spaza shop owner.
Sure.
Let's even go as far as saying the lady trying to sell amagwinya on the side of the road. Let's call it the hardworking woman trying to sell food at the taxi rank.
Sure.
Where do the ingredients come from? So, and of course, juxtaposed or contrasted between a well-oiled corporate machine this side that has got 1,500 outlets to restock. I mean, just one of the corporates trying to fix their inventory recently, which shall not be named, they blew about 1.9 billion just to tweak the software of the inventory that gets delivered. How do we source and supply? So when now you're going to war and you're going to battle with people that have kind of like dumped 1.9 billion in just trying to fix their filing system and their supply system.
Hey, that better be a very good filing system.
I'm telling you. So, and then so the typical farmer and the typical spaza owner might not, for lack of a better word, be consciously aware of the forces at work. Let me be practical a bit here. You own a spaza shop. And for you to be able to trade today, you need to make 1 or 2 or even 3 trips down to a wholesaler. Very popular wholesalers are around. And in your little van there, come back, check what's actually missing, run out again. You are spending more time outside of your spaza shop outlet than you are spending in it. That's number 1. Number 2, you are living hand to mouth. Your cash flow is a mess. Your cash flow is non-existent. It's like you actually can't even tell us what did you spend on your inventory in the last month. Neither can you tell us what you are likely to spend in the next 3 months. So then we're looking at commerce, you see.
Sure.
The moment we mute, you see, the mute button is very useful when you use it intentionally. When we mute the nationality of the spaza shop owner for practical purposes of this conversation, when we mute the unfairness, when we mute the fake foods, when we mute the counterfeiting of foods, then we go like, what's the business model? So you keep dashing out with your little van and you're actually dipping into your pension, which is how some spaza shops start in South Africa. Some old man who's kind of like, they told him, man, you got to take the golden watch, dude. You got to take the golden watch. And even though it's kind of like gold plated, it's not gold, but story for another day. You got to take the golden watch and go home. Then he's thinking, what am I going to do with my life? Then he starts a spaza shop. And then he starts dipping into that pension. And he hopes that he's going to wing it. Things will work. So that's the guy who's pitted against, we mentioned that corporatized retail well-oiled machinery. That's 1. Number 2, let's revisit the foreign national discussion to look at the business model. When you dissect that, you find that there is a cultural tendency for our foreign guests to self-organize into ecosystems. Remember that ant that I mentioned? They tend to plug into colonies. They don't fly solo like I try to. Even though I was not in a spaza shop, I tried to fly solo when I was starting my business like 10, 15 years ago. But they don't fly solo. And perhaps that's a competitive edge that a spaza shop owner needs to consider.
So there's a national network.
There's a national network, and it even goes as far as Durban Harbour. How is it that they don't go to the wholesaler? How is it that the wholesaler does not even exist within their line of sight? Who exists? They would bring in shipments of containers, whether with dry rice, whether with mealie. They have embedded themselves, not just self-organized to pull together financial instruments, but they also have a global network that brings stuff to their doorstep. They have what, in so to speak, they've created a parallel alternate supply chain. Now, a spaza shop is not thinking about a supply chain.
Can we just stop there? Because that's so fascinating and insightful, but it's also, I mean, the reason why I think this conversation is so important is because what can be learned from that? It's not about criticizing that, because there's ingenuity, there's insight, there's a plan. And if we're going to try and create an economy where we bring people out of poverty, where we bring people out of working poverty, and if government's going to think about, okay, how do we marshal black agriculture or any agriculture for that matter in South Africa, we have to look at how it's working,
best practices,
and that's what we have to compete with ultimately.
And talking about how it's working, there's this alternative name to South Africa is Tanzania. So the spaza supply chain parallels lend us to appreciating the origin of the word Azania. It actually didn't, when you look at it historically, it did not originate from Southern Africa. The word actually comes from the Horn of Africa, where the type of Somali, the type of Ethiopia, their forefathers were actually in trade and merchant arrangements, selling to what we could call the Bantu nations that later would descend down towards south. So you mean when you try to open a spaza shop, you kind of like are going to war with the 2,000 years muscle memory of how global trade self-organizes and how that is passed down genetically. So what can government learn from that? As a nation, we need to revisit. I know that there is a dynamic. Politically, I'm just a layman on the street. I just observe things from far, but there is this tension happening now regarding the 28 million people on social grant, and whether that's going to be the dynamic that we go with into the future as a legacy. I have no advisory inputs on that, but what I can say is, do we need to reignite our economic empowerment, not within the framework of what empowerment might be on paper, but could we rediscover our trade advantage? Can we rediscover our entrepreneurial advantage? Because just like how someone once said that, you know what, that child who's born in the hospital, you don't know if they've got a cure for cancer, and so on and so forth. But I also say that you don't know if that same child who's born this morning might actually help us to leap forward in terms of demonstrating what entrepreneurship looks like when it's not tied to a tender. Yes, I love our tender people. Shout out to them. But when that entrepreneurship is not tied even to technology, by the way, I'll throw my name in the hat. Not all entrepreneurship is technology, but technology in entrepreneurship has got an extreme sports side to it, where we can send a much bigger elevator down to fetch a lot more farmers and to close the inequality gap on scale. So I'm just saying that perhaps whether someone is starting a business on the street or someone is starting, or rather is running a startup in tech like ourselves, it's all entrepreneurship. Can we rediscover? I'm from the village. We used to do bartering. Even when I was growing up, I didn't read about bartering in a book, in a history book. We knew that, oh wait, our crops, we've got mealie, they need pap, so we're gonna go to the silo with about 80 kilograms of mealie bags. We're gonna come back, but we need meat, we need protein. So we need to kind of like have this trade-off. So that's trade without any tag, without any tender, even though we need those.
Sure.
But can we rediscover what trade means, so that even if someone is venturing out to start a spaza shop, which is part of the food supply chain, or is venturing out to start a farm, who knows? Maybe some of the family here are thinking about, I need to start a farm. You know, food will always be needed, but a farm is a business.
Sure.
It's way beyond the crops. It's way beyond the livestock. There is a business machinery that one has to configure around the farm operation, because if the books don't make sense, I don't care how much livestock you have there on that farm. If the books don't make sense, you can tell me you're farming 100 hectares or 1 hectare. But it all goes back to what's been happening in the Horn of Africa, where the word Azania was actually born, but later borrowed on Africa South. So we need to reconnect with our organic, resilient, entrepreneurial know-how. It's like how my mom and granny raised me. They taught me resilience and survival, meaning you didn't kind of go like, you know how in corporate sometimes they go like, yeah, the reason why we didn't start the project of producing this 1 billion cups a year is because there's a decision coming up in the pipeline. There's no pipeline in the village. You wake up in the morning and you do what must be done. So they gifted me with survival and resilience. But in corporate, man, I'm very grateful for my corporate days. That's why I got to learn scale. There's a project that we once moved from a zero balance sheet to 5 billion within 36 months. You become part of that equation. It rewires you. It changes you. And of course, when I ventured out and I was not wise like that ant who had to plug into a colony, I was flying solo. Man, the wheels came off. But eventually, I did realize the success of my own with my team. We moved a certain struggling entity within a supply chain to move from 0 to 30 million, also within 36 months. So it kind of like taught me that, wait, business is business. Yes, there's other noises that you go like, yeah, but do they have the legitimacy to trade here? Should they be doing that? Why are they counterfeiting that? Counterfeits are counterfeits. Whether it's a JSE listed that is kind of like whey in their ingredients, like even nitrate. Nitrate can cause cancer, but nitrate is part of such a normal volume of the processed foods. So we need to think about those things, but story for another day. So yeah, that's how a spaza owner or a farmer can be caught between titans of industry, whether it's a self-organized global supply chain that feeds or funnels inventory into the local spaza shops that are owned by our guests from elsewhere, or it's the corporate retail that is now, I hear certain angles in retails, on the further side of the country towards Cape Town, they are eyeing the township economy, and they're thinking, you know what, that might not be such a bad idea.
Let's
encroach in that space.
Let's talk about that, because I mean, we could even go deeper into the the parallel network that you spoke about, and how it has there's a harbor, there are goods that come from outside the country. Absolutely. There's a way of lowering costs. There's a network. There's efficiency in transportation, logistics, and then you start your spaza shop and you think you're going to be able to compete with that whole parallel network
without a purchase power.
Absolutely. But then you've got the traditional titans who own agriculture, food production, so central to our economy, actually of geopolitical importance in this entire region. Right? America looks at us, Europe looks at us, China looks at us, and they're like, wow, minerals and agriculture. They've got it on lock in South Africa. But we know the history of dispossession, of concentration. Take us through, like, when you trace that supply chain, how it goes back to a few hands in the country that may or may not be around the Stellenbosch area and other, and Stellenbosch and Sandton.
Yes. The two capitals. Talking about the agri-value chain and the supply chain, let's look at records. I'm going to look at this purely from a perspective of records.
Absolutely.
Because records is the machinery that we are building and embedding into eFama. Records of where produce came from, which hands touched that produce, and which channels that produce came through to end up at our dinner table.
Sure.
And to end up giving a better take-home pay equitably to the farmer involved. When you look at that, records are at the center of it. And talking about Stellenbosch and Sandton, that's an interesting power dynamic, because a certain uncle from Limpopo, who shall not be named, has put this topic forward to say we need to look at the issue of land. So when you look at the issue of land, I might be naive economically, and I'm not going to claim, politically rather. I might be naive politically, and I'm not going to claim to wear that hat. But when I look at it via commerce, and I look at it via records and digitization, that's my backyard. Someone asked, so if you are going to look at land restitution, how are you going to do so? Because the mere fact of the existence of that land records, you can call it a registry, you can call it a pool of records, is still a fast-moving target right now. Who not only who owns it, but how is the land segmented? And I'm just talking purely records. What looks like 1,000 hectares might turn out to be 80 farms. When they conveniently need to be 80 farms, there will be 80 farms on 1,000 hectares. But when certain financing equations require that 1,000 hectare to be one farm, it is suddenly one farm. It's no longer a consortia. So just at that level, without pointing any fingers, I'm saying that records, they matter. Let me go back to the 2017 events.
The listeriosis thing.
Food, the listeriosis issue.
Yeah.
When that issue broke out and people were dying like ants, there was a talk around, no. You see how most things lead back to Limpopo. You see, there at the processing plant in Limpopo, our processed meat is not part of the other retailers. We have our own, and it just so turns out that later on they were in the same plant, maybe separated by a thin veil of a plastic curtain. You see, so records matter to us when it comes from that perspective.
Sure.
Well beyond a political narrative. So, who actually can access a retail shelf? Let's start there.
Absolutely.
Who can win the championships of placing their foods on a retail shelf?
Because once you're there,
that's it.
That's it, right? That's printing money.
It's automation. Asking that question.
How do you get there?
Asking that question requires us to look at a certain property, a certain facility down in Durban. It's a gaming and hotel facility.
Okay.
There's a notice. At the entrance. It says, minibus taxis must pay 500 rand to enter this property.
Hey.
So you see, it's technical, and I'll show you what it has to do with the food value chain. They didn't say minibus taxis are not allowed. No. They must just pay a levy. Everybody else, by the way, in that same property, pay 10 rand to park there. At minibus, so it's their way. So what am I saying? And this thing doesn't happen in South Africa alone, by the way. It happens at what do you call this? World Trade Organization.
Sure.
South Africa right now even finds itself at a back foot on a food value chain in terms of where we can send our citrus and where we can send our other produce, your avocados. Why? Because there is a certain, not really a monopoly, but there's a certain tweaking of a reality at a global exports, whether you're speaking European Union. There's an alleging of things are tweaked in favor of the powers that be. So locally, who can place food on a retail shelf? You're told it's a come one, come all.
Yeah,
but there's a catch.
Anyone could
Anyone
in
can,
theory.
but there's a catch.
Sure.
You just have to make sure that you tick all the boxes.
Okay.
You tick all the checks and balances.
Sure.
And then
so to be on our shelves, here's the criteria.
Yeah, there's a criteria, and it's a quality assurance. It's a quality assurance.
Okay, sure.
Extreme spots.
Yeah, sure.
And that's what actually inspired us to go into the business of eFama, or the business of rethinking our supply chain, because there was a certain gentleman that we were consulting to under management consulting, and he needed to place his product on a specific retail shelf.
Yeah.
Never mind, it was a design homeware item. It was not even food. But he was told by one of the very reputable quality assuring agencies that because he's got 8 products, he needs anywhere between 250 to 400,000 rands to quality assure one product, just to make sure that it goes through all the checks and balances, and it's given a certification that it can end up being on that shelf. So you see, you and I wouldn't touch the aspect or the topic of food supply chains or supply chains without navigating the barriers to entry that may lend themselves by default, intended or unintended, between Santen and Stellenbosch and elsewhere in the country where decisions are made, may lend itself into an imposed inequality.
Absolutely.
All are welcome. All are welcome. If you can just jump this hoop here.
Yeah, then you're fine.
So, but then we ask ourselves, as a generation that was not part of the arrangement that is in place, we ask as a youthful generation that, wait a minute, is there a way to democratize access? Is there a way to democratize quality assurance without compromising it? Is there a way to almost evoke a Stockfell approach or a self-organizing approach to vet or inspect 20 or 50 farmers all at once, without dropping the ball, because our consumers won't be forgiving if we drop the ball with quality? Is there a mechanism where those gogos or those former corporate, did you know that even there's a growing base of farmers that come from corporate, or they come from engineering, or some of them come from being doctors, they're going into farming. So whether a former doctor can set up a farm next to 20 gogos that are farming madumbe, it doesn't matter. But is there a way to level the play field using technology, not necessarily relying on the quality assurance industry, which is about 240 years old now. So it was built on 2 centuries of embedded exclusion. It's no, we're only going to give the certificate to those guys.
Sure.
Then because those guys have certificates, then their produce can be fast-tracked onto the retail shelf. And then someone can go like, man, I didn't get that shelf because of my skin color. Well, there are other forces at work here. And how is this even happening? Botswana, happening to South Africa now. Botswana and Namibia have rolled down the roller shutters, and they've blocked South African produce in the last 1.5 years, have blocked out produce from South Africa in order to look out for number one, good for them.
Sure.
To try and reboot and retool their own food supply chains because they were a bit food insecure. And their over-reliance on food from South Africa, food imports is something that they were a bit, not looking at. And South Africa also has also been getting a lot of pushback on a bigger level. There's some lobbying discussions about that in Europe where we are told, listen, your citrus might land on European soil with a certain contamination that we may have picked up, a certain variant of an insect that if it lands here is going to wipe out our agri-value chain in citrus. So we are going to put that on hold, your container shipments, your tonnage of fruit. So do you see how whether it happens to us as a nation or it happens to us to a certain part of the nation within a nation? Sometimes quality assurance standards can be set in a way that
it becomes impossible,
appear well-meaning,
yeah,
but lend themselves into the dynamics of exclusion, because to comply is way out. So we need to rethink.
It's really fascinating because I think many people would think, okay, look, if I get my farm moving and I get my produce to a certain level of excellence, then the game opens up. But we don't realize that. And this comes back to things like land reform, things like, just the economy as a whole. And you look at the rural economy. How do we get all the talent, all the resources, and unlock the economic value? It's not just about the farming. It's about who controls that certification, who's already got it, who doesn't want it to be given up.
The doorkeepers.
And I'm assuming that all traces back to Stellenbosch and Sandton, because I'm assuming Stellenbosch and Sandton have those certificates and they get onto the shelves.
Checks out. In 2000 in South Africa, in a parallel industry called astronomy, the space sector, the space industry. When the square mile radius project was passed, or was about to be passed, I think someone did an exact figure of how many space scientists or astronomers we had in South Africa. And it turns out that none of them were black. None. I don't want to misquote the figure, but whatever the figure was, none of them was black. So actively, government did something beautiful. They began funding specific programs that will nudge, whether from rural, whether from the township or elsewhere, peri-urban, those that need to make inroads into taking BSc degrees that are along the what you call it, scientific lines of heading in that direction. Because to turn a ship around that has been on a course for decades, they needed to really, the powers that be needed to unlock resources on a bigger level. So that's their journey. Let me tell you something about African agriculture, not South African, African agriculture. The majority of the youth to this day, and it breaks my heart, still views agriculture as a charity industry. Meaning, man, you shouldn't think of participating as a youth in agriculture in a manner that's gonna earn you street cred, or in a manner that's gonna make you look good, either on your CV or in your beer and coffee cycles. and conversations. But that's really a myth, because if you look at the food science, I'm going back to the certifications, the food science that is required as part of that certification, the agronomy, the agro-processing, the food processing, the supply chain, the e-commerce, the logistics, the demand planning, the supply. It's so complex an equation that when people think of agriculture, we need to evolve or transcend thinking about dirt under my nails. Because if we think more like that, in about 571 Saturdays from this conversation, Africa will arrive at 2035. So 2035 is just 571 Saturdays away. It's not an eternity. We are going to have more than 2 billion mouths to feed. And South Africa alone will be sitting at a population of about just above 70 million at that time. So by then, I'm sure we'll not be eating 1 billion chickens. We would have graduated.
We might be approaching 2 by that stage.
There we go. But then the question becomes, in context with your question, who's supplying those chickens? Who is vetting their well-being? Who is inspecting the poultry farms?
Are we building new voices and new enterprises to integrate into that value chain, or is it all just going to go to the same 2 networks, the parallel network and the Stellenbosch Santa network?
And the corporate retail. No, we need to rethink that. That's why when one is looking at that 50 rand sausage that appears to be behaving weird in a pan, we need to not be emotionally too vested in that sausage that is appearing to look amiss. We need to place everything on mute and ask ourselves, who has a handle and who is gatekeeping or doorkeeping on the macro value chains. And without hating on anyone, we need to look at, are we going to be party to solving this sausage problem? Are we going to be party to solving fake foods problem? Are we going to be party to solving inequality in food supply chains? Or are we just going to be those guys that drink a couple of ciders or have coffee and discuss about what's wrong with the world? You know, we could be looking at think tanks that come together that go like, we're going to do something about it. Let me give you a amusing example. Back in the early 2000s, that Desmond Dube, he used to, long before he became the face of the funeral industry, he was doing his comedy back then, fully fledged. And then he had this thing called Dube on Monday. Dube on Monday was this comedy setup that combined theater, combined on stage interviews. Long story short, they did this performance where in one episode that really stuck with me, they did this performance where they were protesting. It was just a whole lot of people on stage mimicking a protest because protest season was unfolding at the time. And they picked up dustbin lids and they were going up there on stage saying, "Asitenge Doropen, Asitenge Doropen." And then somebody said, "Oh, comrade, hold on. If Asitenge Doropen, where are we going to buy?" Hey, and the person paused and went, no, I got an idea. We're going to buy at Spar. And just when people were thinking that is referring to that the retailer by the same name, he quickly interrupted that. We're going to buy at Spar Za. So let's stop going to town. Let's buy at Spar shops. Fast forward now, 24 years later. The Spazas are in a crisis mode. The big retailers are in a monopoly mode where the well-oiled machine needs a bit of rethinking for our food security and for our food sustainability. So if we can buy a Spar, because Spaza is in a crisis mode. Strange enough, even Spar itself had to sink that 1.9 billion into trying to fix their own supply chain. And if we kind of like still show some love to Stellenbosch, but we are kind of like reconfiguring more equitable food value chains. Those are the conversations we need to be having. Absolutely. Yes, it's tragic people lost their lives. It's tragic that there's all these tensions that keep erupting now and then. within a township ecosystem. It's really sad. However, beyond these eruptions that then are muted, then they erupt, then they are muted, can we be more future focused? Because in 571 Saturdays, 2035 will be here, ready or not. And we need to know whether even our own children are now championing in a different era where a more equitable, more sustainable, more diverse supply chains, where if I say I'm in farming as Shadrack, people won't really assume that I'm a farm worker. And, just a spin on that farm worker thing, I was showing my wife a certain house that I hid under the bed as we traveled home recently because it's on a farm. And I was an illegal visitor on that farm because I didn't go through the gate checking of signing, because I was just in and out for the day to visit my cousins who worked on that farm. Unlike me farming with my mom, they worked on a commercial farm. So I was an illegal guest there. And that may not seem like a big deal, but had something happened to me, the farmer was not going to be liable. That's one. Number two, had I maybe put my hand up and been interested myself into working for that farmer, despite not being documented or being underage. See, that's the other problem. When the wine says it's ethically sourced, is it really ethical sourced? Is it ethically sourced? Or maybe somewhere along the wine route, there is 50% underage children that may be working that wine. Or there is grown-ups that may be paid with wine bottles instead of being paid with money. So those are the things that we have to think about when we either enjoy our wine or we enjoy our food. Where does this steak come from? And I think I mustn't forget about this one. When we are at family funerals, very tragic events, so it's all too tempting when our money is stretched in many, many different directions. It's all too tempting when we are talking and Caesar goes like, man, Shadrack, assuming you're my cousin for now, you go like, Shadrack, man, I don't know if they told you. They told me what? No. Oh, Aunt Banibani says she knows an uncle who knows an uncle, and they can get us a cow at half the price. So guys, I mean, we're already discussing so many expenses as who work in Joburg. So it does not look like an attractive deal now. You see, that's another supply chain gone wrong, because that uncle who knows an uncle, where are they getting that cattle from? Could it be that it's going to be stolen at night and form party to the livestock thefts that are such a problem in South Africa? It might look like a good deal, but you know how sometimes in South Africa, maybe it doesn't happen in your side of the family, but my side of the family, back in the village, of course, there's been this, I don't know how to call it, myth. There's been this persisting accusation that there are these aunts who go to Mqimbi, and when they go there, someone always get poisoned. And you go like, whoa, are we part of Inkabi? Do we have hidden hitmen that, I think there's a Netflix thingy that came up, cyanide and curry. Do we have these people with cyanide that poison people? I don't know if such hitmen or women exist in our society or not, that have a thing for poisoning others. I don't know if they exist or not, but I know that in the agri-value chain, there is vaccines and hormones that are given to cattle. So if a cattle is stolen at night, when the instruction on the vaccination vial says, do not send to the abattoir. If you have dispensed this vaccination, don't send to the abattoir or the slaughterhouse within X number of days or weeks. You won't even be given a movement permit by the Department of Agriculture and Health. You won't be given a movement permit to legally move your cattle from here to the auction or to the slaughterhouse. So you see how those nitty-gritties of the value chain, maybe if we are cousins and we are thinking about how best to spend our money, we might not be thinking about that. And then that cattle ends up there, and then suddenly, God forbid, where we are mourning, now we lose 5 more lives. Are we going to think about the agri-value chain gone wrong? or we're going to think about, yeah, we knew it.
Yeah, there's an
We
artist
knew
in
it.
Yeah.
There's an artist in our midst here.
Yeah.
So just one of the things that I'm appealing to my fellow South Africans to say, let's not be biased when it's the spaza shop owner whose papers may or may not exist, who's doing something that is harming lives in our nation.
Sure.
We must be militant in our response. We must be clear that such conduct is not allowed, or contaminations. But we should also carry the same level of passion when it's a certain corporate that may or may not be owned in Stellenbosch. We really need to realize that fair is fair. And we also need to be militant when a certain uncle suggests that, listen, I know a guy, and I know a guy. We hold on. You may know a guy, but we don't want any more tragic losses in our family. I think if we did that, I lived through Alex before settling on this side of the road. And one of those things is I used to overhear conversations where Amajita are going around in, and they go like, listen, man, there's an address in Santin. Yeah, man, listen. Yeah, no, we're just in and out. We're done. So hearing those conversations kind of like changed my upbringing. And now to hear that Mpofu-Walsh, you hear people that go like, yeah, but running ethical supply chains should not be something we're expected to do as a family. We are poor already. We have this much money, but this funeral that was not expected needs that much money. So leave us alone, man. We are mourning. Just leave us alone. If a kettle is there, there's a kettle there. People are going to laugh at us if we don't have a kettle. So Shadrack, hold on with this whole ethical supply chain. Hold your horses, man. We need a cow, not horses. Hold that. We need to be allowed to mourn our way. I go like, my fellow South Africans, I respect your mourning, but let's be clear, including how our customary practices on how an ethically sourced cattle from a legit farm, how it is slaughtered. Do you know the other cyanide effect, the other food poisoning effect that has harmed my fellow Africans, because I speak supply chains, is when the uncles that are slaughtering the cattle, they just don't realize that washing hands is important. If you're going to prepare that, just wash your hands. No, you can take a knife, you can do your dance, you can whistle, but while you are whistling, can you at least wash your hands with sunlight soap? Can you at least wash your hands up to here, up to the arm here, so that hygiene is part of that food dispensation, even at a small mcimbi, whether at a township or in rural. I'm just appealing to my fellow South Africans that may not be considering things like technology. I get it, but we all have an obligation to, just like all chefs in the world, thou shalt not kill the diners. I think that actually goes right across. Yeah.
So, brother, I think as we round off, where to from here with eFama? What's the next stage for the future?
Brilliant. We are building eFama into an elevator where we are soon wanting to pass a 10,000 mark in terms of the farmers that we are taking in to now connect their produce into the market, to your events, to your hotels, to your, to your eventing spots, but most importantly, to our household. The future is where if I'm sitting and having dinner, I can ask my wife, listen, if it says Karoo lamb there, did it actually come from the Karoo, or am I being charged exorbitantly? Wait, is it even lamb, by the way? Is it even lamb, or is it mutton? Or is it something else? Because remember, before listeriosis, if you go back to 2012, and eFama was not there, and tracing food, track and trace was not there, we had an incident. Retailers that I shall not name, they may be from Stellenbosch, they may, but they ended up admitting that what they labeled as beef was actually horse and donkey and water buffalo. So the future for eFama is one, getting as many farmers that have been trapped in the basement and left out of the economic value chains to be allowed into the room. Let's send the elevator down. That's number one. Two, To simplify the sourcing of food, few clicks of a button, whether you're running a restaurant that's very fast paced or you're running an NGO, could we see you having more savings where your rent can go a bit further? Or you're running a household. I think the food inflation now has passed 40% per food basket since pre-COVID. So we as eFama are ideating very patiently, but we're also putting pressure on ourselves to say how quickly can we include the farmers, how much savings can we bring to the household. We will give you savings. We may not give you speed. It may not be there in 60 minutes, but we are looking at lending ourselves into building that eFama, not just the eFama of the future, but the South Africa of the future is a South Africa where we become less dependent. I'm not sure if our families are aware here, but by 2030, which is just about 299 Saturdays or so, we as Africa, not as South Africa, Africa, we are going to be having to settle a food import bill of 19 trillion rands for food we bring from outside, which is bizarre for a continent with 60% of arable land in the whole world. So why are we bringing in food rather than not just growing food at a level that is making us food secure, but processing that food, packaging that food, and connecting that food to its consumer? So the future is transparent, the future is equitable, the future is fair, and the future is where value goes where value deserves to go.
Shadrack Kubyane, thank you so much for joining us. All the best on your journey, and thank you for the work you do, and we wish you all the best in the future.
Thank you kindly, much appreciated, and looking ahead, thank you kindly.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, bro. Aye.